The inventory of flesh. This is not a story about war. It is a story about what happened after the war was already won. Because for the women taken by the Mongols, survival was only the beginning of something far worse. Spring 1220. The city had already fallen, but the killing had stopped too quickly for comfort. Smoke still drifted above collapsed roofs, yet the Mongol soldiers were no longer shouting, no longer chasing, no longer burning. Instead, they stood in lines calm, methodical, while scribes unfolded scrolls and dipped their brushes into ink. This was the moment the survivors feared most, not the battle, not the slaughter, the counting. Zarya stood beside her mother as boots crunched closer. She was 14, old enough to understand that screaming would change nothing, old enough to know that soldiers who do not rush are more dangerous than those who do. When hands seized her arms, they were firm but controlled, as if lifting property rather than a person. Her mother tried to speak, but a single shove sent her to the ground. No blade was drawn. No threat was needed. The decision had already been made. Zarya was not dragged to a cage. She was brought to a table. A man who had never looked at her before asked her age. Another measured her height with a strip of leather. A third examined her teeth, her hips, her posture. None of them spoke to her directly. They spoke about her, recording observations in neat rows of ink. Her name was never written down. It was unnecessary. A number replaced it, marked on her wrist with dark dye that burned slightly as it set. In that moment, Zarya ceased to exist as a person. She became an entry. This was not random cruelty. It was infrastructure. The Mongol Empire had learned something its enemies never understood. Terror alone fades, but systems endure. Cities could be rebuilt. Armies could regroup. But bloodlines, those could be rewritten permanently. Women were the key, not because of weakness, but because of what they carried forward. Children remembered their mothers. Children became the future population. Control the mothers, and you controlled history before it was born. This belief had roots older than conquest. Long before he was called Genghis Khan, he was Temujin, a boy who watched his father die poisoned. His clan abandoned his family, and his mother starved to keep her children alive. He learned early that morality did not protect the weak. Control did. And when his young bride was kidnapped and later returned pregnant, that lesson hardened into something cold and irreversible. From that moment, Temujin understood women not only as victims of war, but as its most valuable resource. By the time the Mongols rode into cities like this one, the policy was already perfected. Soldiers did not decide a woman's fate. Administrators did. Physicians did. Officials trained to assess fertility, endurance, and long-term usefulness. Women were divided into categories by age and condition. Those deemed valuable were sent into caravans that followed the army. Those who were not simply disappeared. No records were kept of them. Erasure was efficient. As Zarya was pushed into line with dozens of others her age, she noticed how quiet everyone was. This silence was not obedience. It was understanding. Somewhere ahead waited caravans designed not for transport, but for processing. Rolling systems where assault was routine, pregnancy was monitored, and identity was stripped layer by layer. Survival was expected. Resistance was corrected. The caravan began to move at dusk. Chains were unnecessary. Fear and exhaustion did the work. Behind them, the ruined city faded into darkness. Ahead of them lay a future carefully engineered by men who believed conquest was incomplete until it reached the womb. Zarya looked once over her shoulder, not for rescue, but for memory. She needed to remember who she had been before the ink, before the numbers, before the silence. Because she sensed the truth before anyone told her. This was not captivity with an end. It was a system designed to continue long after she stopped resisting. And this system did not begin with cities like hers. It began years earlier, in the mind of a boy who learned that taking land was temporary, but taking the future was forever. The boy who learned the wrong lesson. Every empire begins with a story it never tells out loud. Before women became numbers, a boy learned what it meant to lose control, and what he learned would poison the future of millions. The Mongolian steppe does not forgive weakness. It stretches endlessly, cold and empty, offering no shelter to those who fall behind. Temujin learned this before he learned mercy. When his father died, poisoned by rivals who smiled as they drank with him, there was no justice, no retaliation from the tribe. Instead, something worse happened. His family was abandoned. Overnight, loyalty vanished. Protection dissolved. His mother and siblings were left alone, surrounded by land that killed slowly. Hunger became routine. Temujin watched his mother strip bark from trees, dig for roots, chew leather when nothing else could be found. He watched her harden, watched softness disappear from her voice. From her silence, he learned his first truth. No one comes to save you. From her struggle, he learned the second. Survival belongs to those who take control early and never release it. That belief was sealed years later when his young wife Bert was taken. The raid was quick. One moment she belonged to him. The next she was gone, dragged away by men who knew exactly what they were doing. Temujin searched for months. Every rumor cut deeper than the last. She had been claimed, used, passed between men as proof of dominance. By the time he finally reclaimed her, she returned not broken, but changed. She was pregnant. The child might not have been his. Temujin accepted her. He accepted the child. But acceptance is not the same as forgetting. That uncertainty burned quietly, reshaping how he saw the world. In that moment, something terrifying became clear to him. A man could lose land and regain it. He could lose battles and fight again. But a woman taken rewrote bloodlines forever. Lineage could be stolen without killing a single man. From that moment, women were no longer just people in his mind. They were continuity. They were leverage. They were the future, vulnerable to whoever seized them first. As Temujin rose, uniting tribes through violence and loyalty, he observed what others ignored. When enemies were destroyed, men died quickly. Women survived. They adapted. They gave birth. Their children remembered who had taken their mothers. Those children grew with resentment, becoming future threats. Most leaders responded with slaughter. Temujin chose something colder. If resentment was born through memory, then memory had to be controlled. If identity survived through mothers, then mothers had to be redirected. This was not madness. It was strategy. When Temujin became Genghis Khan in 1206, that strategy became law. Conquest would no longer end with victory. It would continue quietly, inside homes, inside bodies. Women would not be randomly abused. They would be processed, classified, assigned. Pregnancy would no longer be fate. It would be policy. Physicians were consulted, administrators appointed. Fertility was measured. Resistance was broken through repetition, isolation, and exhaustion. Names were erased because names preserved identity. Numbers replaced them because numbers obeyed systems. This was the moment war changed shape. By the time Mongol armies approached cities like Zarias, everything had already been decided. The soldiers were not improvising. They were executing a design formed years earlier in hunger, humiliation, and loss. The women taken were not trophies. They were infrastructure. Genghis Khan believed he was preventing future wars. He believed that by controlling birth, he could control rebellion. He believed cruelty now would save blood later. What he did not consider, or perhaps did not care about, was what happens when an empire builds its future on stolen bodies and erased names. Because the next phase of this system would reveal its true nature. The first cities would soon discover that conquest did not end with occupation. It only began when the counting started. When war ended and the system began, the killing stopped, but the horror did not. For the women who survived, conquest was only the entrance. What followed was not chaos, it was an organized descent. The city fell at dawn, and by midday the streets were silent. Fires burned low, bodies were cleared, and the Mongol army did something no one expected. It slowed down. No celebration. No uncontrolled looting. Instead, officials arrived. Scribes, physicians, men whose hands were clean and whose eyes were trained to observe rather than strike. This was the moment when war officially ended and something far more disturbing took its place. The surviving women were gathered into open courtyards and temple grounds, not rushed, not beaten into lines. Calm voices directed them where to stand. Older women were separated first, the sick next, and the children. Each movement was recorded, each hesitation noted. This was not mercy, it was sorting. Physicians walked among them, touching wrists, lifting chins, inspecting hips and teeth. They spoke quietly to scribes, who wrote without looking up. Fertility was assessed like livestock quality. A woman's worth was calculated in years of potential output. Those deemed unfit were removed. No one explained where they went. No one needed to. The absence spoke loudly enough. The women selected for the first category were marked. Ink pressed into skin, numbers drawn on wrists and behind ears. The ink burned slightly, a small pain that carried enormous meaning. A name could be whispered, a number could not. Identity ended where the mark began. As evening fell, caravans arrived, not carts, but mobile enclosures built of wood and iron, divided into compartments. Each section had a purpose. Newly captured women were placed together to acclimate. Those already pregnant were separated for monitoring. Women who had recently given birth were isolated. The system did not rely on chance. It relied on order. Inside the caravans, the rules were enforced without shouting. Resistance was met with repetition. Day after day, the same routines, the same violations, the same exhaustion. Hunger was controlled, sleep disrupted, privacy erased. The goal was not immediate submission. It was collapse. A woman who stops believing escape is possible becomes compliant without chains. Records were kept obsessively. Conception dates, physical responses, birth outcomes. Mongol administrators tracked reproductive efficiency as if managing a harvest. If a woman failed repeatedly to conceive, she was removed from the system. Her fate was never documented. Failure did not require explanation. Some women tried to preserve fragments of themselves. They whispered their real names to newborns, hoping sound might outlive memory. Others cut small scars into their skin, private markers that said, "I existed before this." But even that was dangerous. Discovery meant punishment. The system tolerated survival, not individuality. What made this system uniquely horrifying was not only its cruelty, but its scale. It followed the army like a shadow, expanding with each victory. Every city added thousands more women to the process. What began as experimentation became routine. What began as policy became tradition. Children born inside the system were classified immediately. Some were absorbed into Mongol households. Others disappeared. Mothers were rarely told which fate their child received. Uncertainty was another tool. A woman who does not know where her child is cannot plan resistance. Within a single generation, entire regions changed. Languages faded, lineages vanished. Villages populated by people who remembered different ancestors slowly became Mongol in blood, if not in name. This was conquest without occupation, control without permanence, an empire reproducing itself through force. From the outside, the Mongols appeared unstoppable because of their armies. From within, their power was far more intimate. It lived in bodies, in pregnancies, in children raised to belong to a conqueror they never met. And the system was still evolving. Because the next campaigns would push it further, bigger cities, denser populations, and a level of organization that would shock even those who thought they had seen the worst. When the Mongols turned their attention to the great empires of the East, the system would expand beyond control and become something resembling a factory of human futures. When a name became a number, the moment a name disappears, resistance becomes harder to remember. What the Mongols erased first was not the body but identity. And once identity was gone, obedience followed quietly. By the fourth campaign, the system no longer felt improvised. It felt settled, almost ceremonial. Cities surrendered knowing what would happen next, not because they had read it in chronicles, but because the rumors had already outrun the armies. Women were not hidden when the Mongols arrived. They were presented lined up in courtyards, temples, abandoned markets, waiting for the counting to begin. Fear had learned the shape of procedure. The marking came first, ink for some, heat for others. Symbols pressed into skin where they could be seen quickly by guards and administrators. Each mark corresponded to a ledger entry: origin, age, physical assessment, reproductive history. Names were not forbidden, but they were useless. Officials did not record them. A woman who insisted on speaking her name was ignored, not punished. Silence was more effective than violence. Once marked, movement became restricted by number. Caravans no longer referred to women as individuals, but as groups units that could be reassigned, redistributed, or eliminated based on output. This was not chaos. It was logistics. The Mongol administration had perfected a language of control that stripped humanity without appearing openly cruel. When something went missing, it was recorded as a correction. Mothers suffered the most under this transformation. Children were the variable Rome had failed to manage centuries earlier. The Mongols would not repeat that mistake. Births were logged immediately. Infants were examined, categorized, and removed according to policy. Some were placed with Mongol families. Others vanished into silence. Mothers were rarely told which fate had been chosen. The uncertainty hollowed them out faster than grief ever could. The women learned to stop asking questions. To resist openly meant punishment. To resist quietly meant disappearance. Survival required adaptation, and adaptation required forgetting. Many stopped speaking their old language. Some stopped remembering faces. Time flattened. Days were measured not by sunrise or prayer, but by inspection and movement. Identity eroded under repetition. Administrators noticed patterns and adjusted. Women who retained strong cultural habits were separated. Those who bonded too closely with each other were reassigned. Isolation was enforced not as cruelty, but as prevention. Community produced memory. Memory produced resistance. The solution was simple: keep them apart. It was here that the system revealed its true ambition. The goal was no longer merely reproduction. It was replacement. Children born within the system grew up without knowing their mothers' names, only their assigned status. History was not destroyed, it was overwritten. Entire lineages faded without ever being recorded as lost. This method followed the army as it moved eastward. Each conquest refined the process. Each new population provided data. By the time the Mongols approached the great cities of the Jin Empire, the machinery was precise enough to operate at scale. Tens of thousands could be processed without delay. The system no longer shocked its enforcers. Familiarity had turned horror into routine. At the center of this expansion stood Genghis Khan, distant from the caravans yet present in every rule. He did not need to witness the results. The structure itself carried his belief forward that future rebellion could be eliminated by engineering loyalty at birth. He believed identity could be reshaped faster than it could be remembered. Some women tried to leave traces anyway. A whispered word to a child, a hidden mark beneath clothing. A story told once, quietly, before silence returned. These were small acts, fragile and dangerous. Most did not survive them. By the time the system reached its height, no one spoke of mercy or cruelty anymore. Those words required moral distance. What existed now was administration, policy, output. The empire measured success not in cities burned, but in generations absorbed. And yet, something unexpected began to appear in instability the ledgers could not fully explain. Because when identity is erased too completely, what remains is not loyalty, but emptiness. As the system expanded into the largest cities the Mongols had ever faced, its scale would finally reveal a flawed one that even numbers could not contain. The factory of generations, this was no longer conquest. It was production, and the future was being manufactured one body at a time. By the time the Mongol armies reached the great cities of the east, the system had outgrown the chaos of war. What followed the fall of walls was not disorder, but scheduling. Entire populations were moved according to plans drafted long before the gates were breached. Officials arrived with scrolls already prepared, columns waiting to be filled. The women were no longer surprised by capture. They were exhausted by inevitability. Processing sites were established outside the cities, away from public view. Former temples, abandoned halls, fenced encampments that functioned like stations along an assembly line. Each space had a role: intake, assessment, reassignment. Nothing was left undefined. Women passed from one stage to the next without explanation, guided by guards who spoke little and wrote constantly. The caravans multiplied. They stretched for miles behind the armies, slow-moving and heavily guarded. Inside them, life was reduced to cycles: movement, inspection, waiting. Days were not counted by sun or prayer, but by checks and reassessments. Pregnancy was monitored. Recovery was timed. Failure was corrected. The language of the system was clinical, efficient, and completely indifferent to suffering. Records became more detailed as scale increased. Administrators tracked not just individuals, but outcomes: birth rates by region, survival rates by age group. Adjustments were made when numbers declined. Diets were altered, conditions modified. The goal was not cruelty for its own sake. The goal was consistency. An empire does not tolerate variables. Women who resisted openly did not inspire fear. They disrupted workflow. They were removed quietly, without spectacle. Their absence was noted as a correction in the ledger. Those who complied were not rewarded. They were maintained. Survival itself became the incentive, and even that was conditional. Children born within the system rarely stayed with their mothers. Attachment was considered inefficient. Some were reassigned to Mongol households. Others were relocated elsewhere, their origins deliberately obscured. Mothers were told nothing. Uncertainty proved more effective than grief. A woman who does not know where her child is will hesitate before any act of defiance. Over time, something darker emerged. Many women stopped resisting not because they accepted the system, but because memory itself began to fade. When days repeat without meaning, identity dissolves. Names were forgotten, languages dulled, even faces blurred together. This was the system's true success. It did not need loyalty. It produced emptiness. From the outside, the Mongol Empire appeared unstoppable because of its armies. From within, its strength lay in normalization. Horror became routine. What once shocked now simply happened. Administrators who had recoiled during early campaigns now discussed output calmly, as if speaking of harvests rather than lives. And yet, beneath the order, cracks formed, not rebellion, something quieter. Women began to withdraw inwardly. They complied physically, but disappeared mentally. Some stopped speaking entirely. Others performed routines mechanically, eyes vacant. The system could measure bodies, but it could not measure absence of will. Productivity remained high, but something essential was slipping beyond control. Children raised without identity grew in unexpected ways. Some obeyed. Others showed no attachment to the empire that claimed them. They belonged nowhere. An empire built on erased origins discovered that loyalty engineered through force did not always endure. Administrators noticed inconsistencies. Certain regions produced children who resisted assimilation. Others produced nothing at all. Reports grew longer. Adjustments multiplied. The system responded as it always did. More control, more isolation, more refinement. What began as a method to prevent rebellion was becoming something else entirely. A machine that required constant expansion to justify its own existence. The empire had bound its future to a process that could not stop without collapsing. And still, the armies advanced. Because no one at the top wanted to confront the question that now haunted the margins of the ledgers. What happens when an empire, as future is built on people who remember nothing belong nowhere and have nothing left to lose? As the system reached its peak, a discovery would surface one that centuries later would expose the true scale of what had been done, long after the empire itself had vanished. The legacy nitrogen monoxide. One wanted to see empires fall, but systems leave echoes. What was done to those women did not end with the Mongols. It survived quietly inside the future. The Mongol Empire did not collapse in fire the way it had risen. It fragmented slowly, stretched too far across lands it could no longer hold together. Generals turned on one another. Borders hardened. Cities reclaimed their names. On the surface, history recorded an ending. But beneath that ending, something far more permanent remained. The caravans vanished. The ledgers stopped being updated. The administrators disappeared into other empires, other courts, other lives. Yet the people shaped by the system did not vanish. They settled. They married. They raised children who carried no memory of where their mothers had come from, only the quiet weight of dislocation. Identity had been erased so thoroughly that even grief lost its language. Chroniclers avoided this part. Official histories preferred battles, tactics, genius. They described conquest as movement and victory as inevitability. What they did not record were the after-effects, the villages where family trees no longer made sense, the regions where names shifted generation by generation, the communities where ancestry became strangely uniform. Silence was easier than explanation. For centuries, the true scale of what had happened remained hidden because it left no monuments. There were no ruins dedicated to it, no inscriptions carved in stone. The evidence lived inside people, dispersed across continents, diluted by time. History moved on, satisfied that the Mongols had come and gone. Then, much later, something unexpected happened. Modern genetic studies revealed a pattern no historian could ignore. Across vast regions of Asia and beyond, an unusually large percentage of men shared nearly identical markers on the Y chromosome. The pattern pointed back to a single source, spreading outward in waves that matched the Mongol expansions almost perfectly. This was not coincidence. It was legacy biological proof of a system that had turned reproduction into conquest. The discovery shocked the academic world, but it also simplified the story in dangerous ways. Headlines focused on one man, one lineage, one figure. What they missed was the mechanism. These markers did not spread through romance or admiration. They spread through policy, force, and erasure. Behind every genetic trace was a woman whose choice had been removed, whose identity had been stripped, whose future had been decided by administrators with ink-stained hands. The empire had fallen, but its most invasive act had succeeded. Generations were altered. Populations were reshaped. Entire regions became something new, not through assimilation, but through design. The Mongols had not merely ruled the present. They had rewritten the future, and yet there was no triumph in this ending. An empire that engineers loyalty through erased identity creates people who belong nowhere. Children raised without roots inherit obedience, not attachment. Over time, that emptiness spreads. What looks like control becomes instability. The same system that prevented rebellion also destroyed meaning. It produced survivors, not citizens. This is why history softened the story. The truth was too uncomfortable. It revealed that power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it whispers, records, categorizes, and waits. Sometimes it wins by convincing the world that what happened was inevitable, necessary, even efficient. The women who endured this system left no unified testimony. They could not. Their names were removed. Their languages faded. Their memories were isolated by design. But their existence can no longer be denied. It lives in the bodies of the future, in patterns that refuse to disappear. What happened to enemy women under Genghis Khan was not an accident of war. It was a deliberate strategy that transformed human life into raw material for empire. And the most disturbing part is not that it worked, but that history tried to forget how. Because once you understand this, conquest is no longer just about armies and borders. It becomes something far darker. It becomes a question of how far power will go when it decides the future is more important than the present, and how easily humanity allows it to happen, as long as the story sounds heroic enough when it ends.